My name is Diane Tipkin-Pitak. I am this year's chair for the Urban Design Committee. Welcome again, everyone, to our very first event of the year. We've been working on this program for many months now and are super grateful to have Kate, Jeannie, Paul, and Andres with us tonight. Kate is our MC for tonight, and she is amazing. She is the planning policy leader at ARAP and has previously served as Deputy Secretary of Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination at the California State Transportation Authority. I'll let Kate tell you more about herself and the rest of the panel in a few moments. So before we get started, just a quick reminder to be on the lookout for our next event happening in May. We'll be discussing SB9 with Ray Golden, formerly an architecture critic for LA Weekly, and a few other folks. Crossing our fingers that this event will stay an in-person event. And I also want to do a quick shout out to our new committee members. There are some new faces you'll see working with us at these events. We have Alon, Apurva, Anna, Jeff, and Tang joining myself, Mario, and Tony. Thank you for what you all do. And anyone else who is interested in working with our committee, please do reach out. And with that, I will pass it on to Kate.
Great, thank you so much, Diane, and thank you, Tibby. Thank you for the invitation. We're just so delighted to be here and get to share some what I think maybe used to be radical ideas, but I don't think they're quite as radical anymore. About transforming our roadways. And we're focusing on Los Angeles, but we're bringing in some examples from around the world and across the US. With that, I will start sharing my screen here. And yeah, California Dreamin'. So I think, when you hear that phrase and the song, there's certain things that come to mind, and the open road and palm trees and the history, as we said in the announcement, is actually a lot more sinister. And if you look at how many people were displaced when the roadways, highways went in, it was over 1 million people, mostly Black and brown people across the US. And so people lost their homes, people lost their businesses, people lost their communities. It was really divided up our cities in particular. How can we start to redress those wrongs that happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I'm not going to focus on the history because I think hopefully many of you are familiar with it at this point. We really want to look forward, and how can we really start leveraging the new federal dollars, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, to really do infrastructure right this time, right for people and right for the planet. So we do have an amazing panel. I'm just so happy that you all accepted the invitation to be here tonight. I'm so excited to introduce you to Jeannie Wardwaller. She is a longtime friend now, and I was so delighted to be able to recruit her maybe, 5, 6 years ago now, to Caltrans when I was up at the state. And she was on the advocacy side, and she was running Safe Routes to Schools and the Bike Coalition, California Bicycle Coalition, and she's a trained engineer and brilliant, and so knows Caltrans backwards and forwards from the outside. So I was like, okay, Jeannie, time to come inside. We need you. We need reforms. So so excited to have Jeannie serving at Caltrans now. She keeps getting promoted. Now she's the Deputy Director for Planning and Modal. So that's Jeannie. So delighted to have Andres join us. Really appreciate you jumping in here, Andres, from Mobility Justice. Andres is a longtime LA lifetime LA grew up on the South Side and son of immigrants, and has really championed a lot of the incredible things that have been going on the streets of Los Angeles over the last few years, really reclaiming the streets for people. So he's going to talk about some of that work that he's done. And then last but not least, I've got my colleague, Paul Moore, who is a principal in our planning practice at AIALA. And he is also an engineer, a planner, long history in transforming roadways from a very practical perspective. So I'm going to share some global examples, talk a little bit about the federal money that's coming down the pike, so to speak. Jeannie is going to talk about what she's doing at Caltrans and centering equity and reconnecting communities. And then Andres is going to talk about mobility justice, his new role there as executive director, and his work in Los Angeles on the ground, literally. And Paul's going to share some very practical solutions that could be implemented and have been implemented across the US and in Southern California. So I mentioned I wanted to give some sort of global perspective first. This is actually Seoul, South Korea, and it was a freeway that was built in the 50s. It might look kind of familiar to, a lot of us in the States as well, because we have a lot of these built right through the center of town. And in 2003, it was taken down, and in 2005 or so, they uncovered the creek that ran underneath and converted the whole length of it, about 3 miles, through the center of Seoul, South Korea, as a linear park, and planted 30,000 trees, new pedestrian space, as you can see. This is an image at night. It's really become a tourist attraction. There's been 30% increase in property values compared to neighboring areas. It's been quite a boon for Seoul. And the climate benefits are extensive as well. The heat island effect, it's gone down. This area has gone down by 8 degrees Celsius. The PM10 air quality levels have gone down by 20% pollution. And then an important part of this project is that it wasn't just taking down a freeway. It was part of it was restructuring their bus rapid transit system to be much more effective and more efficient, much more reliable. So that was part of the project, was restructuring the bus system, and accidents, collisions, injuries have been reduced by 1/3 since this project went in and the bus system was restructured and more people were taking transit. The other example I'm going to give real quick is also super inspiring in Spain. This 1970s ring motorway cut off Madrid from the Manzanares River, and in 2008 it was replaced with it's about a 4-mile section. It all went underground, and it's one of the longest urban tunnels in the world, and allowed for playgrounds and this huge park, bike paths. 32 footbridges have now reconnected. You can see a couple of them here, have reconnected Madrid across the river. So those are a couple inspiring examples, but what can we do here? What's the opportunity here? And I wanted to talk about the infrastructure bill. So this is a summary, and shout out to Talia, who's listening in, who has helped me put this together. And as you can see, the breakdown of the infrastructure of this $1 trillion+ infrastructure bill, most of it is transportation. $284 billion for transportation, which is really, this is a generational opportunity to to rework our transportation systems. And you can see of the transportation dollars, most of it, the lightest blue there, is roads, bridges, and major projects. So as far as I'm concerned, that's what we're talking about tonight: roads, bridges, and major projects. We would like to see, we're going to be we're tracking all of this money and want to make sure it gets spent on the right types of projects. I will say, also mention that there is a call out in the darkest blue there, or black in the middle, is the Reconnecting Communities program, which it's great to have a carve out specifically for reconnecting communities. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that program. So this is a new program. The Federal Highways is rolling out. Second quarter of this year, we'll start seeing more about the guidelines, but this is what we know so far, is that applicants can be state, local, tribal, metropolitan planning organizations. So in Southern California, that's SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, or your counties, LA County could be an applicant. Nonprofits are eligible. So if there's a nonprofit that is advocating for one of these Reconnecting Communities projects, they can apply for planning funding. What is it for? And the upper right there, by the way, is a project that AIRA worked on in Glendale, a capping project through downtown Glendale. We have that designed per the Caltrans standards and everything. So Jeannie, pay attention, because we want to get that funded, hopefully. So facilities that are aging, that are likely that need replacement or significant reconstruction within the next 20 years are eligible for this program. And frankly, that's most of the urban highways in America would fall into that bucket. And what are they looking for under this program? It's facilities with major barriers to community connectivity, like high speeds, grade separations, other things that are really dividing communities. And they're looking for projects under this program that are removal, retrofitting, other types of mitigation that enhance and improve communities. So very exciting that the Biden administration has put this out there. And you can see how it divides up over the next few years. The money, it's $1 billion, which is way less than we had hoped, but at least it's a start. And the idea is it can be matched with some of those other funds that I shared on the last slide, the other highways, roads funding. So it's just, kind of pushing everything hopefully in a better direction, roads funding. And so there's planning money, and there's also money for actual capital construction, which definitely would need to be matched with other dollars, because it's not that much for big capital projects. So that's a little bit about the federal bill. I'm going to hand it over to Jeannie to talk about what's going on at Caltrans.
Thank you so much, Kate. A fabulous intro. Love seeing all the examples from around the world, and also just appreciation to you for your kind words. Hi everyone, I'm Jeannie Wardwaller. I'm the Deputy Director for Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans, which is kind of a mouthful. I'm responsible for planning for the future of our transportation system, and particularly for a multimodal transportation system. So I have our research program in my portfolio. I also support a lot of federal funds that are passed through, federal and state funds that are passed through the state DOT down to the local agencies. So a lot of local funding that gets granted to cities, counties, MPOs goes through my part of Caltrans. So I like to say that I am the part of Caltrans that is forward-looking and leading strategic change. So that's my shorthand for my job at Caltrans headquarters up here in Sacramento. So really pleased to be with you. I'm going to talk about a lot of the work that we've been doing to advance equity at Caltrans, which is not necessarily something that the state DOT has been known for. It's truly an exciting time. So I want to share with you, some of this is going to be pretty high level, state policy kind of work, because that's where I sit in Sacramento. But I'm going to share a couple of examples that I think you'll be interested in, and then I'm happy to talk more about some of the project work that might be coming down the pike. So Jessica, if you could jump to my next slide for me. So really importantly, Caltrans is known for the past history that Kate talked about, building the freeways. We started as the Division of Highways, and a lot of our infrastructure that we still own and operate today was responsible for dividing and displacing communities across our state, particularly communities of color and low-income communities. And we still see the effects of that today. Obviously, communities that are near freeways still have their travel access divided. They experience the effects of traffic and safe, unsafe streets to travel on, particularly by foot. They have barriers to transit access, obviously air quality effects. So what we've done just recently, just in the last couple of years, under our director, Tokso Mashakin, is acknowledge that history and make a strong statement of how we intend to do things differently going forward. So in 2020, fall of 2020, we adopted an equity statement that lives on our website. And this is just a short quote from that statement, but the statement started with an acknowledgement of the history and the impacts, and the fact that those are due to intentional decision-making by transportation decision makers of the past that resulted in putting up barriers and effects that we still see today in terms of inequities. We recognize our responsibility in changing that now, and have really made some strong commitment in the 4 Ps, we call them, to change our workforce, make sure our workforce is more diverse and represent of the communities we serve, that our programs and projects meaningfully engage those communities and make them a part of creating the improvements going forward. Partnerships, which refers, not just to all of the transportation stakeholders that we work with, but also the job creation opportunities that we have, making sure that we're providing those to individuals who may face barriers to employment, as well as disadvantaged businesses. And then the planet, of course. Climate change is such a present and huge issue for us that we're really, obviously the Newsom administration has made its top priority, one of its top priorities. So transportation plays a huge role in that. And the effects of climate change will fall hardest on vulnerable communities, frontline communities. So we want to make sure we're thinking of them first in addressing climate change. So as Kate described, and from where I sit, we're in a truly exciting time of change in transportation, probably more than in a generation or more, in terms of how we could transform our transportation infrastructure in the coming 5 to 10 years. The commitment from the federal government, from the Biden administration, to invest in infrastructure, but particularly to put things like climate change, equity, safety at the forefront. Complete streets, which is what we refer to as kind of making streets accessible for all people. Those are key priorities, and they align directly with the state of California's goals. So it's really exciting to be at an agency like Caltrans right now, because we're on the cusp of kind of fundamental change in what it means to be a Department of Transportation at the state level. So huge appreciation for the Biden administration, and also Governor Newsom for making California for all, or this championship of equity, really key. And it is creating huge opportunities for us at Caltrans. So next slide, please. Just a couple of other things I want to highlight in terms of how Caltrans is changing. I created an Office of Race and Equity in my program last year, and we're really very heavily committed to retraining our staff to think about what it means to do transportation projects. Sort of engineering of the past has been, we know what's best, we know what project should be best here, and we're trying to flip that and say, the community knows best, and we want to make sure that the community is engaged in our work. But that does take like a big culture and mindset shift within our workforce. So we've spent a lot of time focusing on workforce development and training. We're also doing some equity listening sessions, going out with our top leadership and also with 2 other agencies. Excuse the acronyms there. I thought I removed all the acronyms from my PowerPoint, but the CTC is the California State Transportation Commission, and CalSTA is the California State Transportation Agency, where Kate used to work. Those are sister agencies to us under the umbrella of state transportation. So we're all partnering on doing some deep listening in communities that have been heavily impacted historically by the transportation system, and trying to reframe how we think about things like systemic racism in our system. We're also developing an equity index, which will help us overlay a series of health burdens, pollution burdens, also demographic indicators to identify which communities across the state are most burdened, most underserved by transportation, and make sure that we really are focusing our investment and our outreach attention there. So that's really exciting. That's just underway now. And then we're working with a few other state agencies on removing names, racist names from memorial highways, state parks, other place names across the state. We have a lot of named facilities on our state highway system and memorials. And this is something that Governor Newsom has really been committed to, particularly as it comes to tribal communities and tribal governments. Really trying to atone for the genocide and harm that was caused to Indigenous communities when California was first settled or colonized. So lots of interesting, again, I told you I was going to talk to you about the policy work and the things that we're kind of doing at the headquarters level. But if you jump to the next slide, Kate mentioned Reconnecting Communities in the federal program. And even before the federal program was adopted, we were talking about doing this work in California and really, finding ways to transform community connectivity in communities that have been divided by freeway development. So working with the State Transportation Agency, we have identified lots of opportunities, including some funding in the state budget, to develop a program that really is community-centered, where our staff are going out and engaging directly, doing robust engagement, and planning ahead for things like displacement or gentrification, the land use changes that might come once we do make significant improvements to reconnect communities across freeways. So that community engagement really must come first before you draw plans, envision different scenarios, look at what re-envisioning that corridor may look like. The community really needs to be engaged and make sure that they benefit from those improvements. So this is a really becoming a really big part of how we do our work going forward. And it's really, I can't tell you how fundamentally different that is from how we've done transportation planning in the past. So it's really significant. If you take anything away from me, Caltrans is becoming a totally different agency than it's been in the past, which is really exciting. So next slide, please, Jessica. And I want to just mention a few specific things in this area, in this Reconnecting Communities program that we're working on. The first really focused transformative effort that we're already starting to fund the planning work and the engagement work is in Oakland on the 980 corridor. This is a somewhat underutilized section of freeway that goes right through downtown Oakland. Clearly divides. I'll show you a map on the next slide, and has been identified in Oakland's general plan by Mayor Libby Schaaf as a corridor to, potentially return to the community, potentially convert it completely from a freeway back into a boulevard or into a park, or something that will provide higher value to the city of Oakland and really reconnect the city. So we're excited at Caltrans to be funding the planning study and starting to do community engagement and outreach. The scenario development stage will come next once we've really reached in and started engaging all of the stakeholders that need to be involved. But I think there's a whole slew of different options that we could consider, anything from affordable housing development to, as I said, a boulevard or trail or park. So it's really a truly exciting opportunity to transform Oakland. We're also utilizing some other planning funds and grant dollars that we administer at Caltrans to initiate other planning efforts in communities around the state. Our Caltrans districts have identified 70 different neighborhoods that they would like to do this work in as we get going. So it's just, the scale of freeways and opportunities for projects like this is really massive in California. So we've got a lot of work to do, but as I said, it could be really transformative. And then the governor's proposed budget, which comes out in January of every year, this year does propose $150 million to seed this Reconnecting Communities program in California, and also to be used to leverage the federal dollars that Kate talked about. So we're looking to that to really, get all of these, potentially 70 planning efforts going around the state, but then ultimately start to fund and match federal dollars to build some of the projects that we envision from that planning work. And Kate already talked about the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I won't rehash that, but $1 billion doesn't go that far across the country, especially if we're talking about doing freeway caps or freeway removal. But it is going to help us really get this work going. And I hope that we can be kind of the most competitive state for it, because we're already thinking and planning and embracing this kind of work. So on the next slide, I just wanted to, I know you all are architects, so you like visuals and design. I just wanted to show you, this isn't a rendering, this is a photo of what the 980 corridor looks like today, but you can see, there's not many cars on it in the middle of the day. It's certainly a huge swath of land going through downtown Oakland that could be repurposed for better use. So next slide, please. I'll try to be efficient here. So what we have, another thing that we have been doing that is, not quite at the scale of something like 980, transforming 980, but has really been significant at Caltrans, is we're reconnecting communities by doing something that we call complete streets. You might be familiar with this, this idea or concept, but a complete street is one that's safe, comfortable, convenient for all users, no matter how they're traveling, and users of all ages and abilities. So we have embraced this concept at Caltrans over more than 10 years and are really finally turning the corner and implementing complete streets, this idea of complete streets on all of our projects, every opportunity that we have. So if we're going in and just doing, kind of routine pavement work, that's an opportunity to improve the sidewalks, improve the landscaping, put in street trees and furniture, add bike lanes, even better protected bike lanes, and make that street one that is really comfortable and inviting and safe for everyone, no matter how they want to travel. So we've made a lot of progress in this area. My next slide, if you jump to the next one, Jessica, highlights again kind of the policy level work, because that's where I sit. So apologies for hitting so much on policy, but the policy is really important in such a big department to embed and institutionalize the change. So we've got a couple of policies. Our Complete Streets decision document is one that requires every project team to document how they are including complete streets, and that is required. It has to be signed off at the executive level that they've done their due diligence to to make sure that they're not missing opportunities every time we do a project. And then the director's policy is one that comes straight from the top of the organization. Again, kind of top down, bottom up, we're making sure that we have the mandates to do this work in a really smart way. And we have a Complete Streets action plan that lays out, really important activities that we're doing all across the department to make sure that this work is happening and we're not missing opportunities. On the next slide, I just wanted to highlight one project. I tried to pull in some projects, but I'm sorry that I don't have more. This one is in Eureka, way up in Humboldt County. This is an example that we've recently funded through our, routine pavement work, but kind of gives you a visual before and then a rendering of, how this particular street can look different with some very cost-effective improvements that were added just recently in our major rehab program. And then on the next slide, I just have a snapshot of some other improvements that were added to recently to a set of projects that we funded out of that same rehab program. So we're really trying to stretch state dollars as far as we can to make sure that we are including complete streets type improvements every opportunity we can. And I think it is and it will make a really huge difference in communities, particularly those where the state highway system is the main street, like in a more rural context. Sometimes that's the main business district, commercial district is also the state highway. So these kinds of improvements can be truly transformative in reconnecting those communities. So I think with that, that's my last slide, and I'll hand it back to you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Really appreciate it. Andres, do you want to jump in? What's going on in LA?
All right, can everybody hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, perfect.
So hello, everybody. My name is Andres Ramirez. I'm Executive Director for People for Mobility Justice. And just a little bit about our organization. Our mission is to seek critical consciousness about mobility justice for all communities. We're based here in Los Angeles County. We've been doing work since 2012, so we've been around for 10 years now. Our vision is for all people to have freedom and resources to move in public spaces with love and dignity. And at the heart of our work, of how we approach this work, is something that we call the 5 Ds of mobility justice: decolonize, recognizing, that we're occupying indigenous land, that we sit in Tongva land. There's also a long history of displacement when it comes to investment, and I'm glad that Jeannie brought that up as something that Caltrans is working on, because there's a long history of that in our communities. Decongest, obviously, right? Making the roads accessible for all folks, all forms of transportation. Decriminalize, which is a key one that's often overlooked when talking about transportation, right? But the right of people of color to be able to move around the streets without harassment from over-policing and violence, frankly, right? And that we've lived over the last couple of years, or been magnified more the last couple of years, right? Dignify, so the ability for our communities to move about in the streets with dignity, right? And that includes folks who are living in the streets. That includes elders, youth, disabled folks, having a respect for our community, right? And lastly, dream, right? Participating in the process of imagining, designing, and ultimately construction of projects in our communities. Just a little bit of background on what we mean with mobility justice. We created the definition for mobility justice as a convening of nationally with organizations doing transportation advocacy across the US. We identify mobility justice as demanding that we fully excavate, recognize, and reconcile the historical and current injustices experienced by BIPOC communities. And for those who may not know what BIPOC communities means, it's Black, Indigenous, people of color. BIPOC communities must be given space and resources to envision and implement planning models and political advocacy on streets and mobility that actively work to address historical and current injustices experienced by BIPOC communities. And we really feel this map is a great example of that, right? This is the old redlining map for the city of Los Angeles, or in the greater Los Angeles area. And I like maps. Maps are a great way to visualize when we're talking about inequities in our city. If we were to overlap, the Colorado screen, for example, you see a lot of the red areas continue being red, right? Or for example, the communities hardest impacted by COVID. Once again, you'll see a lot of the same overlap, right? That's one of the descriptions of or characteristics of mobility justice, is understanding that the discussion of justice for us is multi-pronged. Transportation is a key component, but we also got to consider the housing crisis, the jobs crisis, the health crisis that are all being concentrated in communities of color. But we are able to do that, right? There's so much excitement about the possibility of resources being invested. And we're glad to see that our years of advocacy have finally seen fruition with champions like Jeannie at the state, talking about equity and equitable distribution of resources, right? A key component that has to be this engagement piece that has forever been overlooked, right? And it's more than just lip service, right? It's more than just holding a meeting with people in the community and checking that box and moving along with your plan, but it's genuine engagement with folks, right? Collaboration with local stakeholders, understanding that even though folks may not be trained as engineers, architects, they have clear expertise about the roadways and the facilities in their communities and can give great input to inform design, right? And some of the examples of which we've done this practice, we've done street charrettes, where we like to call street charrettes, the traditional charrettes of showing design examples, giving about people an opportunity to do so. We only do this out in the bus stops or by the schools where people are actually engaging in the corridors that we're targeting. We also organize bike audits, checking out the facilities with a catered bike ride, walk audits, you name it, right? Time and again, we see, right, that engaging with community gets interest and knowledge about what's going on and really provides the folks who are doing the ultimate design of these projects great insight into what will make a project successful. We also believe pilots and pop-ups are an important process of developing some of these projects, especially in BIPOC communities. The long history of this investment has led to, really a blank canvas for our communities, right? A lot of times when it comes to these investments being available, our communities are last in line because we don't have the capacities to compete for these funding sources. There's not ready-made, shovel-ready projects. There's no projects that are already envisioned in our communities. So a lot of times we have to kind of show what these projects can look like. Some of these examples I've shown here are projects that we worked in the past. The image in the middle is a temporary scramble walk we installed on Florence and Crenshaw in the middle of South LA. Many of the folks in the Department of Transportation scoffed at the idea of doing a scramble because of the potential impact on traffic. But by showing so, we were able to show that it didn't, right? And it actually was a successful way of connecting the community for pedestrians, for transit riders and vehicles. Traffic runs smoothly throughout the day, right? Another example, the one you see of the kids playing soccer, that's a vacant lot in our community, right? Our communities are also concentrated with a lack of green space, right? And that has to be a key component of design when we're thinking about reimagining our roadways. How do we create public spaces for our communities that can help impact our health in positive ways? And lastly, embedding art and culture. Talking about the conversation around displacement, the real fear of this investment coming heavily in our community at the cost of our ability to afford to live in these communities. That's a real concern for a lot of folks that are doing work in BIPOC communities, especially with large events like the World Cup, like the Olympics coming to LA. There's a precedent set in other cities worldwide in which poor people, and particularly people of color, are pushed out for the sake of showcasing the city's best face, right? And that's why for us, we feel as these conversations about infrastructure investment comes forward, it is vital that we not only integrate the input of community members, we also integrate the culture of these communities, so they feel like they're made for the communities that are living in these corridors, and it's not for the benefit of others, right? You know, that's one piece that we constantly are finding challenging, is that, you know, as these projects get created, they continue to be in more affluent communities, the communities that are not communities of color, frankly, right? Our communities usually get last dibs on these resources. So we want to change that dynamic. When we hear a commitment to equity, we hope and frankly demand that it really means equity of investing in the highest need communities first, and the haves needs to wait this time around, right? That's how we create that balance, because there's been decades and decades of disinvestment in our communities. And despite that, our communities are rich when it comes to culture, when it comes to art, when it comes to food, you name it, right? And how do you make these assets really emphasize them and magnify them? So it brings up, it is embedded in the design of reimaging these communities. Thank you for your attention. And, you know, this is some of our information. My name is Andres Ramirez once again. And, you know, I look forward to having a further discussion with y'all.
Thank you so much, Andres. Thank you for all your leadership in Los Angeles. There's some questions in the chat. We'll be taking those. Feel free to put more in there. But we're going to have one more presentation, and Paul is going to bring it home here in terms of real practical ways that cities and our designers can get involved with some of these street design changes and what's possible, you know, even with limited budgets. So go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the roadways that communities have restructured, and a little bit about what has driven those projects and allowed them to happen. You know, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad, probably. I'm gonna start off in talking about some U.S. examples in a couple categories. First is freeways. Second is local streets. So one of the things about rethinking freeways is that cost is a big driver. Taking out a freeway facility costs money. Figuring out how to reassign the people, you know, so Kate said in Seoul, they restructured their bus system. Sometimes you've got to rebuild a roadway network, and you have to think about what you're replacing the thing that you took out with. So a lot of cost that adds up. As a result, in the past, these big projects have tended to happen in places where there's a big economic development return. So next slide. Here's an example. This is in Milwaukee, the Park East Freeway, which is really just a stub of a freeway, really kind of a long exit ramp that cut through. You can see at the top right a bunch of neighborhoods, kind of went up and over. One of the interesting things about this is that the freeway goes up and over, and the street network that was down below the freeway was still there. It was, you know, it had never been taken out, and so there wasn't really a replacement cost. All they needed to do was take the freeway out, and they opened up all these city blocks along the river for redevelopment, a big return on that investment of pulling out that freeway stub for them. The next slide. This is Cincinnati, the sad Cincinnati folks who just lost the Super Bowl. They restructured the Fort Washington Way. So you can see on the left the kind of suburban-y, meandering ramps going, you know, right along the riverfront, their most valuable property. What they really did was just skinnied that whole corridor up, made it more urban, made the crossings shorter. But in the yellow, you can see it. You know, the real estate play was that it freed up a bunch of land on the riverfront where it was really valuable. The next slide. And what they've been doing is you know, master planning and building out development all along those properties. You can kind of see at on the left-hand side on the master plan too, those rectangles above the freeway were also set up so that they could very easily be capped and create green space over time as more funding became available. This is Chattanooga, Tennessee, that also was separated from its waterfront by a really pretty unnecessary freeway design. They reduced it to a 2-lane street. As part of this, they also built a park and a green space along their riverfront. This was a fairly costly project. It's a $120 million project, and you can kind of see the list of places where they got the money. A really diverse list of things, ranging from hotel taxes, private contributions, but pretty proudly at the end of that, $0 from City of Chattanooga general funds. So, and they have calculated they got about $2 billion in downtown private investment that followed this. So they felt like it was a very good deal for the city. So moving away from freeways and down towards streets, the drivers of those tend to be a little different, and they're varied drivers. So sometimes it's safety. This street reduction in Charlotte was actually really controversial while it was under construction, because what people saw was they saw a lane of traffic being taken away and bike lanes being put in an area that wasn't really bike connected to most of the rest of the city. Once the project opened, everybody realized what had really happened was the traffic had slowed down, the crosswalks felt much safer. That was something the community was really in favor of. And I think the city learned the lesson after this of really communicating clearly what they're trying to achieve with the project before they get under construction, that this was a safety, a walkability project, something the community really wanted. Sometimes these can be about community character, some of the kind of culture things that you heard Andres talk about. These are different ways that people have made bike crossings safe and tried to reflect some of what the community is about, whether it's an arts community, and having something that adds to the character and the kind of aesthetics of an area can be a driver sometimes. And then oftentimes the business community is a driver. This is in Des Moines, Iowa, a part of the city that has lots of shopping and bars and restaurants, and the street that ran through the middle was just, again, too fast and didn't feel safe for people to cross. And so they skinnied it up. They, again, ended up with the bike lane as part of it. But for the businesses, the real benefit was safer crossings, a more comfortable environment for people that were shopping and dining and drinking. So those are some examples from around the country. So what have we done in Southern California? I think our Northern Californias are a bit more famous for these things. So the Embarcadero that famously took down another freeway stub and replaced it with transit and distributed traffic back to the network, and got the ferry building back. The Central Freeway, Octavia, which took down a freeway and built a boulevard that it connects a really walkable set of neighborhoods and created space for other community amenities and green space and lots of different things.
I worked on that.
Good job. But here in LA, we've made some progress as well. So famously Broadway, rather than waiting around for the construction dollars to be ready to rethink Broadway, the city moved forward on creating space for dining and pedestrians and even green pockets, really pretty economically, with paint and bollards and things that could get things reorganized while we're waiting for the dollars that are kind of for the more streetscape type elements. All of us have seen the changes that have happened over the last 2 years. The city of Los Angeles was fortunately ready with a plan for slow streets that they were looking for an opportunity to implement. And once the traffic died down at the beginning of COVID, they ran it all out, implemented it. We've seen the parklets and the little dining, the cafe dining that's happened in the former parking spaces all over the city, that the city's trying to move towards making a permanent feature. It's been obviously very popular. This is San Diego, kind of a dining, shopping, little commercial neighborhood node with a big wide roadway that, in the next slide, they dramatically reduced. Again, this is about having people from the neighborhoods be able to walk to the places they want to go. And on the next slide, enjoy those places rather than being nervous about having to cross the street and what they might be facing. A lot of times, communities, if they see the need strongly enough, can advocate, for local needs. This is a street in Santa Monica that it basically didn't have space for sidewalks and on-street parking and space for cars to move up and down the street. So they worked to advocate for a shared street that allows for parking. It has space for people to walk, and the cars that go through kind of have to weave their way through in the space that's left over for moving. Really, those moving cars are the lowest priority on the street. This is in Pacoima, in Los Angeles. Top left, you can kind of see an alleyway that had some flooding and some drainage issues. And rather than just fix the flooding, which was important, the community said, we need a gathering space, we need open space, and so having something that can serve that technical function with drainage, but also be a community asset, was what the community said they wanted and what was delivered. And then really dramatically here in Los Angeles County, Lancaster Boulevard. So this is kind of near the freeway, near a Walmart, what Lancaster Boulevard looks like, what it looks like, along most of its length for most of the last 60 years. As you kind of move down, in the next slide, you start to see some cues that things are changing. So you see some streetscape elements to the side. As you move along, you start to see vertical elements, the trees, the bike lanes, things that are telling you you're coming to a more urban space. And then when you get to, what Lancaster was creating as their downtown, this is what you have with the on-street parking on the side, the angle parking in the center, really skinny. Yeah, on the next one, you can kind of see the overhead shot of the really dramatic streetscape that they have, and the complete transformation. The really interesting, Lancaster was really smart about the way they executed this. So on the next slide, you can see the former condition of this section on the left. They did this project for $12 million. And the reason they were able to get it done for $12 million is because they were smart about where they spent the money. The things that cost money are moving curbs, moving drainage, moving utilities. They left that alone. That red curb is right where the curb was before. They spent the money in the middle of the street with the pavers for the parking and the planters, things that were visually very dramatic, changed the character, but didn't chew up a lot of money. So really smart and strategic about getting the most impact they could, for a sum of dollars that they were able to get their hands on. So that's kind of what I wanted to share about the U.S. and Southern California. And Kate, I'll throw it back to you.
Great, thank you, Paul. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate you all sharing your expertise and all the exciting things that are going on in streetscapes and street life and rethinking our roadways in the climate emergency, in the social equity emergency that I think we find ourselves in here. So how should we do questions?
Well, we're thinking that folks should put them into the chat room. We've got a couple that we so far, but please, folks, if you've got, presumably there's this is provocative enough that there's got to be a higher level of curiosity. And so please enter your questions, and I'm sure we'll have enough time to get to quite a few. We have till 7:30. So I would like to start with Alan. He's got a question for Andre.
Yeah, so the question, hopefully you can see that, Andre.
I can, yeah, Alan can ask the question. Go ahead, Alan, you're on, you can unmute yourself. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Hey, yeah, so Andres, I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you meant by bike and walk on it in your presentation.
Yeah, of course. So these are the bike audit is a bike ride facility, usually facilitated by an individual or group. Really with eyes on analyzing the facilities or the lack of facilities on a particular target corridor. Noticing, you know, the conditions of the road, the speed of vehicles, the accessibility for bike parking around business, things like that, right? Usually we do this through surveys that will ask to fill out at the end of the ride. Similarly, a walk audit would do the same, focused on pedestrian facilities, right? So lighting, you know, bus stops, amenities for pedestrians to access, ADA compliancy, for example, things of that nature, right? But it's IDing what are the things that might be missed if you're only analyzing through Google Maps, for example, or something like that, right? Once again, it's really utilizing the expertise of folks that's who we target usually for these type of events are folks who regularly traverse these corridors and ready to get their input.
Thank you, Andres. Holly, you had a question, Holly Harper, for Jeannie.
Yeah, it's just, I'm with city planning in Los Angeles, and I was really interested. You said that Caltrans had a list of 70 communities, and is that list available anywhere, or is it still like an internal, discussion? Thanks.
Thank you for the question, Holly. It is a little bit of an informal list at this point. It was our initial assessment, asking we have 12 districts around the state. So we put out a call to them for applying actually for a federal grant last year to say how many, neighborhoods in your district would you like to work and do this kind of, reconnecting communities planning work. And we did get 70 different communities that they identified, but we haven't published that list anywhere. I think it's important that the districts, being kind of the local boots on the ground at Caltrans, are reaching out and forming partnerships with community-based organizations and local cities and other stakeholders in those neighborhoods, and that we kind of start there before broadcasting where we are going to do work, because that, of course, attracts development interest and kind of changes the conversation a little bit. So we want to be really mindful of making sure these are community-centered efforts as we're starting the different planning studies. But I'd be happy to talk offline and share, some of the communities that we are looking at and that we've started talking to. We've gotten a lot of community support from groups that we work with regularly that really advocate for equity and environmental justice for this work.
Thanks so much, Jeannie. I know the couple of projects that have been put forward for freeway capping are in those fancy areas where there'd be a big economic impact. So I'd like to,
right.
It'd be good to have a continued discussion offline. Thank you much.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're very, very conscious of the sort of displacement and gentrification impacts of changing transportation infrastructure. I mean, we see that. I think that's one of the big criticisms of things like transit-oriented development is if you're not, protecting and kind of putting the policies in place to make sure that the people that live in the community today, receive the benefits from that kind of transformation, you really can, miss the boat. And so we're very conscious of that. Thanks.
Jeannie, I have kind of a follow-up. Maybe I think that some of the folks might be interested. I mean, it's so great, your leadership in headquarters and really working on reforms and centering equity and all this great work. But then, it's sort of, how does it get translated? Because mostly people interface with the districts. And so I'm just wondering about that relationship. What's the latest with that? And if the folks online here or other local activists want to get involved, or designer, want to get involved with one of these projects, how do they start with the district?
Yeah, great question, Kate. Our districts do tend to work really closely with the cities and local groups in those districts. Some districts are very large though, so that our District 7 covers Los Angeles County and Ventura County, which is, I think, 25% of the population of the state. So it's pretty hard to be as locally grounded as, our district up in, Eureka, Arcata, that's responsible for that North Coast kind of region of the state is. But I absolutely, our districts there are lots of fantastic people working in the districts. And I would say that the culture shift is happening just as much out in the districts as it is in our headquarters office. And I think, the example, some of what I talked about with our Complete Streets work is really, just being embraced in the district level. And there's a huge amount of change that we're seeing in projects. And they're really, I think, excited, sometimes with government workers, if you're in a big bureaucracy like Caltrans, you can feel often pretty disempowered from, being creative and engaging and bringing forward ideas. And I think part of what we're seeing with the culture change is people are feeling empowered. Like, we're not quite as boxed in by rules and policies as we might have been in the past. And we're trying to really give people permission to be, to think outside the box and approach their work in a different way. And I think that is, can be kind of incredible for folks that have been at Caltrans for 10 years or 20 years to suddenly be like, wait, I can work on these creative ideas that I thought there was never a path to before. And so sometimes it doesn't take much. I mean, and I've been really just like so pleased and impressed by a lot of our district staff and the initiative that they're taking and just this opportunity to engage, because often they do care so deeply. They live in these communities that they're serving, so they care really deeply about the local communities and making sure that we're serving them. So it's just about empowerment often, not necessarily about totally retraining them.
Great. I'll keep going. Tony, you're
No,
on.
sorry, I was muted there,
Okay.
and I think I lost my connection and got back on.
Go ahead.
Mario has a question for you. Mario?
Yes, thank you, Tony. I'd like to thank all of you for the presentation, the panel. And what I really appreciated was the contrast between, I would say, the ephemeral type interventions that Andreas presented. He was talking about pop-ups, these kind of more temporary, events, versus a more permanent and large scale projects that Jeannie, Kate, and Paul spoke about. And, maybe initially this is a question for Andreas, but, I wonder if you can think of examples or cite examples of where maybe some of these temporary events have led to more permanent solutions. And, maybe we're seeing this now because of COVID, where in Santa Monica, for instance, some of these streets like Main Street, a lot of the parking has been turned over to restaurants. And I don't know that that's going to remain permanent. It'd be great if it did. But then I think about how, like in Europe, there's car-free days that most cities observe. And, that's contributed to perhaps cities like Oslo that have gone largely car-free in certain core parts of the city. And so I think that's where, there's this case of these ephemeral kind of, one-off events that turn into something that's more of a ritual and then has a long-term effect on a city. So I'm just curious if there's maybe initially for Andreas and then for the others, when have you seen any of these, temporary pop-up events maybe evolve into something that's more long-lasting?
Yeah, of course. I think a clear example I would say is the project that I helped start called Free Los Angeles, where we reimagined vacant lots in inner city Los Angeles. When we started the project, it was unheard of, right? Very skeptical of the ability to, transform vacant lots into an asset for communities. But by doing pop-ups and showing that, in essence, communities will use these spaces if they become available, the city, that has evolved into the city creating policy now that local stakeholders can access city-owned vacant lots and convert them into, whatever kind of space they can imagine, right? I actually did a project in my previous job with Pacoima Beautiful out in the Northeast Valley, in which a vacant lot that was across the street from an elementary was reimagined into a pocket park that's utilized by families on a daily basis, right? Other examples I would say, just any and all bike facilities that have come to communities like South LA, the Northeast Valley, Oil Heights. When we first were really getting started on this mobility justice movement in the early 2010s, the city was looking at, improving the bicycle network. Unfortunately, the original plan the master plan that came out at that time excluded a lot of these communities, right? And it was only by organizing these pop-up events, showing facilities in these communities, that we're seeing the great shift that we're seeing now, right? From both planning, the Department of Transportation, et cetera, of actively thinking of creating projects in communities, in BIPOC communities. So that's why I said the significance of creating pop-ups, we have to show, right? Because it doesn't come naturally from, unfortunately, the folks that have the power to do to implement these projects, right? All the examples, the great examples that were shown today, you think about it, those are all affluent communities, right? We're talking about Hollywood, we're talking about Santa Monica, we're not talking about South LA, we're not talking about East LA, we're not talking about Pacoima, right? And these are communities that are more heavily traversed by pedestrians and transit all multimodal modes of transportation, right? And yet we don't have as many examples as you would like to see, right? And that's a dynamic that we have to shift. And we utilize these events as leverage to prove not only are these projects, doable in our communities, but they're needed and should be created and should be prioritized. And we're finally seeing that shift now, right? But it's been years of struggle to get us there, right? And we expect continuous struggle because, unfortunately, a lot of the folks, and that's the challenge I would give in this space, right? When you're creating a plan or design for a community, get to know that community, go to those streets, get to know what's going on there, right? You can't do your planning and design from your office space, from a map that you look on your computer. You'll miss a lot of things that way, right? And that's one of the aspects that we started doing. We started inviting the planners and engineers. We organized rides for them, so you could see for yourself what we're seeing that helped inform your design, so you create a sustainable and successful project, because that's what we want to see in our community at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see, folks like Andres and his group's efforts change that pattern of, only doing these projects when there's this clear financial payoff. I showed that Pacoima project, which was really spearheaded by a local group, Pacoima Beautiful, who did all of the community leadership, all of figuring out what people needed. We were there to sort of help them with technical advice and how you build stuff, but they were doing the leadership. They were doing that collection of information and saying what the need was. But there's still some of the things going temporary to permanent, there's still that economic aspect. So for example, Ventura closed down their main street during COVID, and council voted, a couple months ago, they want to keep it closed permanently, for the restaurants, for the dining and things. Definitely that same, that economic model of the kind of affluent people and the affluent part getting attention and getting sort of their needs made permanent. So that economic impetus is still there, but I think, as I said, Andres and folks like him are starting to make a dent in and change that model, hopefully.
I would like to add, I am excited by this idea of the concept of reconnecting communities. I mean, there's a long history of roadways, disconnecting our communities. A lot of them were built through the heart of our communities, right? So definitely, I think the future looks bright, right? However, we're also wary, right, that the language of equity can be co-opted, right? affluent communities are real quick to talk about equity in their projects because they know that's what state agencies and federal agencies are looking for. So that's one piece that we have to be careful with, right? Don't exploit equity for your own gains, right? Like there has to be a true commitment to mobility justice in order for to create, you know, the cities that we all envision, because it's the benefit for everybody. It's not just the benefit only for communities of color, but those are the missing ingredients, right? Heavy investment in certain sectors and not others, but we have to balance that out.
Great, thanks, Andres. Great question, Mario. Can we reach out to Brian Wallace has a question regarding funding and federal monies. Brian?
Yeah, hi, I'm in Pasadena here. Maybe we're an affluent community, I guess, by comparison, but so be it. We have our own challenges. We have that Rose Parade that comes through Colorado Boulevard every year. It limits really what we could do with that street, which can be a lot more. We've had some limited success with repositioning some of it for outdoor dining. We're trying to hold on to it. I'm in what's known as Playhouse Village, right in the middle of the downtown, trying to repurpose the street. We have a great vision that we've created from Mullen Polizoides, who did the Lancaster plan. So we, really aware of what can be done with great streets to create great places. So, and I appreciate the presentation of the panel. So Kate, maybe my question goes to you. I missed a little bit of your synopsis of some of the new infrastructure bill funding. And, along this line of sort of relative cost to impact, the Reconnecting Communities programs and projects seem to be maybe focused on incredibly large scale or massively expensive projects, which might eliminate a mile or two of freeway, but how many other streets around our regions and our state could be transformed with that amount of money? So whether or not that's the vehicle, pardon the pun, we're looking to use, the new federal bill, other bills, you mentioned nonprofits are eligible. I run a nonprofit business improvement district. So, we're partnering with our city, getting the projects into our capital improvements program. But as we all know, everyone's chasing, the same pot of money and everyone sees a pot of gold in this new infrastructure bill. But what's the reality there? And what's the applicability to projects like this, where we've seen recent interest, but maybe it's way down the queue in the order of priority for our cities and other agencies in terms of getting funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's interesting work for a downtown or a business improvement districts, because I think in a lot of places, those organizations can be really the driver, so to speak, for change, for positive change. I'm working with Indianapolis, Indy downtown on rethinking the loop around Indianapolis. So I think it's great to have your the business community leadership. In different places there's different leadership. So yeah, but your point about there's this one pot that we've been really focused on tonight, the Reconnecting Communities program, that both the federal government and then you heard Jeannie has the governor's budget is proposing some matching funds. And yeah, those are focused on some of the bigger, projects, but there's lots of other funds as well. And I think we're focused on that program because it's just it's new and it's transformative and it's really trying to get at, this major challenge of divided communities by highways. But I think in terms of the more, smaller scale improvements, there's all kinds of other funding available, both on the federal level, and then maybe I'll kick it over to Jeannie to talk about some of the state programs, because a lot of the federal dollars go through Caltrans, or some of it goes to the counties as well and the cities. But I don't know, Jeannie, if you wanted to talk about like the active transportation program or shop or.
Yeah, and happy to follow up to offline, Brian, if it's helpful, so we don't get in too much of a rabbit hole in the specific project, but it kind of depends on what the real goals of the project is, because we've all of our transportation programs have somewhat different goals. You know, we've got highway safety improvement, we've got active transportation. It sounds like, you know, depending on the scale of kind of transformation you're looking for this project, you know, you likely would have to piece different pieces of funding together. So, you know, there's lots of strategizing that would need to be done. But I will tell you, I mean, this issue of sort of serving underserved communities that have been left behind and disinvested, you know, that's becoming a priority across the board. And I think Andres is right on that, like, we have to make sure that's not lip service or a license to push people out of their communities. But that is a lens that we're looking at in a lot of places. And even the active transportation program that Kate just mentioned, which has been a state program since 2014, that has the lens of serving disadvantaged communities. So a lot of these you know, there's not enough money to go around to every community. So we really are trying to prioritize communities that have not been served in the past, which I recognize is a challenge for communities that don't meet those metrics. But it's, you know, really a question of justice and righting some wrongs that have happened in the past.
Paul, I don't know if you spoke a little bit about some of the, you know, improvements that can be made that are not hugely expensive as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's, you know, kind of basic to just like look at the space you have between the curbs and do some thinking about, you know, whether there's a better way to use that space. And, you know, kind of hearkening back to one of the questions before, you know, I think what a lot of communities have figured out is when they do a quick kind of temporary restripe, whether it's to pop up and test something out or you know, because that's what they're going to do to phase in. A lot of times they find, well, that's working pretty well. And if we come into some money, we're going to go spend it someplace else where we can do some other good. So there is kind of this momentum that happens with those quick, fast projects that, you know, they're doing 80% of the job anyway. And the community's like, all right, we're good there. Let's just keep it.
Yeah, it's convincing the city that investment was worth it and trying to keep it, and, you know, trying to piece together enough to keep the bones in place while you get the bigger project funded over time.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks everybody. And Jeannie, please say hi to Tokes. I used to work with him in Nashville as we were young planners 20 years ago. So
One thing I would add, I think there is a question that comes up constantly on a state level, right? How do you raise the capacity for highest need communities to access these fundings, right? Because that's really one of the barriers, right? The communities that have the highest needs tend not to have paid staff who could write a proposal to get them the resources they need. A lot of times they lean heavily on you know, planning and engineering agencies who step forward and offer their services, right? And that's a piece that's important, right? The support these communities need to put viable projects forward is so vital, because that's what the continued practice of communities being left behind. You know, that's why I brought up the cooptation of the equity language, because I'm seeing it, right? Because continue seeing the communities that do have the capacity to you know, apply for resources at the forefront, being, you know, putting in all the right language and commentaries in the proposals that, you know, convinces the agencies to continue to award them, right? So that's an important conversation to have, right? Of what are the barriers and challenges and what are solutions to overcome them. There is no ready-made solution, right? It still continues to be a challenge, but it's something that we have to continue to address.
Thank you. Maria Sipin? Sorry, Maria, do you have you've got a question in the chat room?
Yes, it's Maria Sipin. I just had a general question to ask if y'all can identify any barriers besides funding to make complete streets implementation happen, and how could outside partners be helpful in collaborating or pushing to really change the trajectory of these projects towards success.
Anybody want to take that one?
I'm happy to offer some. I think one of the biggest tensions is the or one of the biggest challenges is the tension between the community traveling through and the community that cares about the street, and the power dynamics of people wanting a smoother, faster commute or trip to wherever they're going through that community, and what amenity and quality of life and comfort and convenience the people that live and work in that community want to see. So I think there's a lot of you all are probably super familiar, more than me because I live in Sacramento, but a lot of examples of complete streets projects that have gone in and then come out because of the community opposition to slight delays in auto trips, matter of a few minutes that it might add to somebody's trip to work can ruin a project. So I think that is really that sort of political tension and that power dynamic is really probably the biggest barrier. Funding, is we can ultimately find funding to implement a lot of good projects, but it's got to be accepted by the community. And I think the question, Mario's question earlier about sort of what does it look like to transform or do something temporary that then becomes really transformative is terrific, because community just needs to be able to re-envision the street, and they need to sort of try it out. And the more we can do things like that as pilots, I mean, the challenge with pilots is if you do them too cheaply, people don't actually have the vision. So you got to do them well enough on a temporary basis. And we've started really seeing more and more investment in this idea of sort of quick builds or, pilots and pop-ups, which is great because it gives people an opportunity to really try it out and realize that this is not going to ruin my business if we take out a couple of parking spots in front of my business, and actually maybe it will mean more business because more people are biking through business district that want to just easily stop instead of driving around the block to find parking. And Ciclavia, I just have to say is, and I think Andres, PMJ, I thought was involved in getting Ciclavia going, right? Am I right about that?
To expand to South LA and Southeast LA. Yeah.
But what a transformative, and if you could do that every Sunday, there's a lot of cities that do things like Sunday streets. Bogota and Colombia, as they completely transformed and built out all this bike infrastructure in really short order, and their bike mode share grew by 5 or 10% in the city, or grew to 5 or 10% in the city within a matter of a few years, just by having people envision their streets differently and interact differently. So those sorts of things, I think, are how you tip the scale. Sorry, I'm going on too long. I'll stop.
I was just going to add, Jeannie, to what you said. I think that tension that you talked about of the people living there versus the people moving through there, I would say is exacerbated in Los Angeles, particularly by the political system, right? The city charter, vests the power with the council. And the convention within council is that any council person can veto a project in their district. And so, the city went through a long process of developing an active transportation plan, a bike plan citywide, and the council people have just been picking the projects off. Just, one group of people got in their ear, convinced them to knock them off. And so it's really difficult here to do anything systematic and have that kind of community voice hold up over time.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would add to that though, we also got to be aware of who are the stakeholders that folks are engaging, right? Because the common practice or the easiest practice is you engage folks that are already active. That tends to be people in neighborhood councils, type people who are part of block clubs and whatnot. And those tend to be a lot of NIMBYs, right? That don't like change and are the loudest voices that are complaining about these things. But I think that's why it's so significant to also get the opinions and voices of the folks actually traversing these corridors that are not just driving through, because their input is so valuable to give the other perspective, right? Because they live through the pedestrian collisions and see the deaths that have occurred, right? As opposed to someone who just thinks of the convenience of their drive. Because that's what we also discover, right? People in the community, biking is not a recreational thing, that's their form of transportation, right? Or the bus system is vital for them to get around the city. Not every, because I think there's this fallacy of LA or this vision that's been created that this is a car city, right? That's the image that's sold a lot. And that's not necessarily the truth. This is a massive city with a lot of people. Not everybody in the city drives. And, you know, as a matter of fact, quite a few people in the city don't drive, right? But their perspective has also often been ignored. This city has been planned to benefit, you know, vehicular driving, right? That was a decision that was made decades ago. And that's where we're shifting away from that culture, right?
Mhm.
It's gonna take effort, right? It's not gonna be easy for sure, right? But I'm glad, Jeannie, you brought up Ciclavia, because when Ciclavia first started, there was so much opposition to it, right? People were thinking the city was gonna become a gridlock because we're closing certain streets and oh my God. And that's not what has happened, right? It's really become one of the trademarks of the city now. People look forward to Ciclavia and participating and really getting to know the city in a much different way that you don't see it when you're driving through it. And those are the kind of things that we got to continue to do. And it has to be embedded. I mean, I think that's the part the shift that I'm hoping for, right? Because I'm glad that people keep bringing up the engagement part is key, but it's not only that we do it, but that it's resourced to be done, right? Because that's often forgotten about, right? It's an afterthought. And people come to organizations like PMJ, hey, can you help support, talk to some people? And we're like, well, we can't do things for free, y'all. You know what I mean? And so,
Andres, sorry to interrupt. We're kind of running low on time.
Sorry about that.
And we could go on forever. There is one more question from Alejandra. Actually, I got one if we could squeeze it in. Tibby's got to jump. If you've got to go, Tib, no problem. We can do a wrap here. But Alejandra, why don't you ask, if you're still on, why don't you ask your question? Is she on? I don't know. Well, I tell you what, then I'll ask mine. We mentioned this the other day when we were chatting, and it was sort of something I was going to leave with you to think about. There are two things that I seem to think we're good at when it comes to infrastructure: being really, really slow at it, and making sure that it is unbelievably expensive, right? So for all of those tax dollars that are part of this federal bill, we wonder how much we actually get out of it here. And I was wondering if you folks had some ideas on how we could expedite this process, get more, and make it less expensive. And if there are any ideas there, because I think there's a significant amount of cynicism that circulates around these bills, because they're huge, but we don't often seem to get much out of it, and certainly not within our generation. So thoughts on that?
That's a big question, Tony, to drop at the end.
There you go, man. I had to be polite. I had to, sorry.
But let's see. I think a key thing is to be ready for it. You always hear about shovel ready. And I think to, Andre's point earlier about these pop-ups and, Brian talking about what he's already doing in Pasadena, like you have to be able to show that these projects are ready to go. And so there's been a lot of work. I know, like my senator here, Scott Wiener, has really been trying to, cut through the CEQA red tape. And, if it's a, pro-climate transportation project, you shouldn't have to go through all the environmental. So that saves time. And just, how can we get these, pro-climate projects, get through environmental faster and ready, shovel ready. So that's, and it also takes, really imagination and leadership from all designers and activists to be able to really, move forward with these projects, put these projects out there and work with their city councils and their state agencies and everything to get them in the queue. And I think wherever you can demonstrate, I think that's what part of Andre's work is so important. If you can demonstrate alignment between the communities and the cities, and being able to go in unified as this is what we want, then you're in much better position to actually get the money.
Anyone else? It's money and speed.
Well, as the government person on the panel, I feel like that's a little bit directed as me. So I'll just offer, Tony. I mean, it's an incredible challenge for us, and I think because we are trying to do very different things with our infrastructure, we need to see different kinds of performance from our transportation systems. We cannot keep expanding highways. In fact, we're really talking here about downsizing them. We have to have people travel differently. We have to give them other options. And I think, I mean, I said this to you on the pre-call, I think it's true. There's a strong tension between making the process democratic and open and transparent and doing it fast and pushing it through. There's a big tension there. And that is something we struggle with in government. And I'll say, you know, on behalf of where I sit at Caltrans, it is a huge focus of mine. I want us to be more efficient. I want us to be more transparent and accessible. I can give you my personal commitment from my program and the authority that I have, that it's a huge priority. And we can also be, you know, we can utilize technology, we can utilize, you know, new tools that are available to us, data, you know, in a much more powerful way, I think, to make better decisions about what we do build. And that's really important. Every project does not have to be a big, expensive infrastructure project. Some of it can just be using the infrastructure we have today a lot more efficiently. Mm-hmm. So we just have to get smarter. And as Kate said, you know, welcome ideas from designers, people in the industry. And I think most importantly, the communities that are going to be served by the infrastructure as well. That's got to be centered, because a lot of today was developed by people who thought they were smarter than the communities that they were serving. And we're trying to flip that. But you know, I hope we can deliver on the promises. I'm very committed to it from where I sit.
Well, thanks, Jeannie. I don't think Diane was able to get back on. So, Jeannie, you're our new but benign Robert Moses. We're putting we're counting on you here.
Please don't give me that title.
Yeah, no.
I'd like to be a very different government.
I hear you. But on behalf of the Urban Design Committee, I wanted to thank Kate and Jeannie and Andres and Paul for a great presentation and a great Q&A.